Make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any inspiring stories I share. The Oakwood County Courthouse stood tall, its marble pillars a symbol of justice, at least on paper. Inside, that illusion shattered. Judge Franklin Greaves loomed over the courtroom, his thin lips curled in a smirk. 3 decades on the bench had earned him a reputation, a very specific one. If you looked like Camille Turner, you never stood a chance. Camille, a black mother of 2, stood beside her overworked public defender. She had never been in trouble before. Not a single mark on her record. Yet today, she faced fraud, resisting arrest, and assaulting an officer, charges that had snowballed after a misunderstanding at a grocery store. A misidentified credit card. A clerk's assumption. A police overreaction. Now, she stood before a judge who never showed mercy to people like her. In the front row, her husband, Mayor Desmond Turner, sat still, his fists clenched. He had fought battles before, political wars, city corruption. But this was personal. The air was thick with tension. Then, Judge Greaves spoke. Judge Franklin Greaves adjusted his robe, his fingers tapping lazily against the desk as if this entire proceeding bored him. He exhaled through his nose, then finally spoke. Mrs. Turner, his voice slow, dripping with condescension, I have reviewed the evidence, and it is clear that you are exactly the type of individual our justice system must take a firm stance against. A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. Desmond clenched his jaw. Greaves' gaze flickered toward him. A smirk. A challenge. He wasn't just sentencing Camille, he was making a statement. This court has no tolerance for criminals, no matter who they are married to. Camille stiffened. Your Honor, Silence. The gavel cracked against the wood like a gunshot. This is my courtroom. You do not speak unless I permit you. His lip curled in disgust. He stared down at her, then at Desmond, savoring his power. As I was saying, you are exactly the kind of repeat offender. Camille's fingers clenched into fists. I have no prior record. The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence. For the first time, Greaves faltered. Just for a second. Then his smirk vanished, replaced with something colder. He leaned forward, locking eyes with Camille. You do now. The words cut through the air like a blade. Camille's breath hitched. She could feel the walls closing in. The gavel struck the bench again. I am sentencing you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. A gasp ripped through the crowd. The prosecutor flinched. Even he hadn't expected a sentence this harsh. Camille felt her knees weaken. The room swayed. Her lawyer muttered something. Asterisk, a protest, an objection, asterisk, but it barely registered. All she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Then, a voice cut through the noise. Desmond stood. He wasn't a man who raised his voice. His presence alone was enough. You can't do this. His words weren't a plea. They weren't a question. They were a statement. Greaves grinned. He had been waiting for this. I can. And I have. He raised the gavel. Then, he slammed it down. And just like that, Camille's fate was sealed. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. Reporters swarmed like vultures, shoving microphones forward. Mayor Turner, what will you do? Do you believe your wife's sentence was racially motivated? Will you appeal the ruling? Desmond Turner ignored them. His steps were slow, controlled, not out of hesitation, but out of necessity. Every muscle in his body was taut, every instinct in him screamed for action. But this wasn't the time. Not yet. His security detail cleared the way, and within seconds, he was inside the black SUV, the door slamming shut behind him. Inside, silence. The low hum of the engine, the muffled voices of reporters still shouting outside, the rhythmic clicking of Reggie Mark's pen as he tapped it against the leather seat. Desmond exhaled through his nose, staring out the window. We can appeal, Reggie said finally, his voice calm, measured. It'll take time, but we'll fight it. Desmond didn't answer. Reggie leaned forward. Des, you have to respond. The press is already running headlines. Mayor's wife sentenced to life by controversial judge. We can. No appeals. Desmond's voice was quiet but absolute. Reggie blinked. Excuse me. Desmond turned his head slightly, his jaw tight. I said no appeals. A long silence filled the car. Reggie adjusted his tie, shifting uncomfortably. Then what, Des? What's the plan? Desmond exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the leather seat. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, cold. Greaves has been untouchable for too long. Reggie scoffed. Yeah, tell me something I don't know. Desmond ignored him. Everyone knows what he is. But no one's had the power to do anything about it. Until now. Reggie frowned, his fingers tightening around his pen. You're the mayor, Des. You can't. Desmond finally turned to face him, his eyes dark, calculating. I'm not talking about politics. Reggie swallowed. He had worked alongside Desmond for years, had seen him fight, negotiate, and win battles most politicians wouldn't dare to touch. But this? This was different. This wasn't a campaign. This wasn't strategy. This was war. Desmond's voice dropped to a whisper. I'm talking about justice. Real justice. Reggie shook his head. Des, listen to me. I know you're angry. I know this is personal. But we have to be smart. This isn't some street fight. This is the justice system. If you go after a sitting judge. Desmond's fingers tightened into a fist. He went after my wife. Another silence. This time, heavier. Reggie sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Okay. Let's say I believe you. Let's say you're serious. How far are you willing to go? Desmond leaned back, his face unreadable. Far enough. Reggie studied him for a long moment, then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small notepad. He flipped it open, scribbled something down, then tore out a page. He slid it across the seat. Desmond took it without a word. Reggie sighed again, shaking his head. You didn't hear it from me. Desmond glanced down at the paper. One name. One number. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to breathe. Judge Franklin Greaves had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Judge Franklin Greaves had no idea his days were numbered. 3 weeks after Camille Turner's sentencing, he sat in his grand mahogany-lined study, sipping an expensive scotch, relishing the latest headlines. Another case closed. Another person crushed beneath his gavel. His career had been built on power, on knowing that no one could touch him. Not the politicians who whispered behind his back. Not the protesters who had called him out for his racial bias. Not the so-called Mayor Turner, who had sat there in court, glaring at him, powerless to stop what had happened. Powerless. That was the key word. He took pride in that. The Turner woman had made the mistake of believing she could speak back to him, challenge his authority. He had taught her a lesson. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, smirking. Life in prison, he muttered under his breath. Married to a mayor and still couldn't save herself. He chuckled, took another sip, then stopped. Something felt off. He frowned, licking his lips. The drink tasted different. Or was it just his imagination? A sharp throbbing pain stabbed through his skull. His hand trembled slightly. Strange. He reached for his phone, intending to check the time, but his vision blurred. The numbers on the screen twisted, doubling, warping. His fingers barely brushed the device before they went numb. A wave of dizziness slammed into him. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. He stumbled, knocking over the glass of scotch, amber liquid spilling across legal documents. His breath hitched. His chest tightened. A sharp pain shot down his left arm. What was happening? His knees buckled. The floor rushed toward him. He crashed down, his cheek pressing against the cold marble tiles. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His lungs refused to expand. His heart pounded, erratic and violent. Somewhere in the distance, he heard a faint ringing. His phone. A call coming in. He blinked sluggishly, his body growing heavy, his limbs like dead weight. He barely registered the name flashing across the screen before his vision faded to black. The official report ruled it a heart attack. The city grieved publicly. Newspapers ran flattering obituaries. Judges and politicians spoke solemnly about his years of service. A great man lost too soon. A pillar of our justice system. A loss for the legal community. But behind closed doors, in hushed voices, some murmured a different story. No one questioned the autopsy. No one demanded a second opinion. No one pointed out how Greaves, a man in perfect health, had suddenly collapsed, alone in his study. No one asked about the last person seen leaving his estate that night. And no one dared to look too closely at the guest list of a certain private gala attended by Mayor Desmond Turner just one night before the judge's sudden demise. Camille Turner's case was reviewed within days. An error was found in the proceedings. Charges were quietly dropped. She was released before the month was over. Desmond Turner never spoke about what happened, never addressed the rumors. But those who truly knew him understood something the reporters never would. Justice had been served. Camille Turner stepped out of the Oakwood County Correctional Facility, inhaling the crisp autumn air as if she had never breathed before. The sky was wide, open, endless. For weeks, she had only known the suffocating walls of a prison cell, the constant, metallic hum of fluorescent lights, the echoes of slamming doors, the weight of injustice pressing down on her like a slow, crushing force. But now she was free. Her children ran to her first, their little arms wrapping around her waist, their sobs muffled against her coat. She dropped to her knees, holding them as if she'd never let go again. Desmond stood a few feet away, watching. His face was unreadable, but his eyes told a story only she could understand. The cameras were there, of course. The press, the political vultures, the so-called justice reform advocates who hadn't done a damn thing when she was sentenced. They snapped photos, recorded footage, whispered about the mysterious reversal of her case. But Desmond ignored them all. He took 3 slow steps forward, reached for her hand, and held it tight. For the first time in weeks, Camille's shoulders relaxed. She was home. The headlines changed overnight. Breaking: Judge Franklin Greaves' sudden death sparks controversy. Errors in Camille Turner's case lead to quiet release. Did Oakwood's most controversial judge die of natural causes? But no one pushed too hard. No journalist dug too deep. No prosecutor demanded an inquiry. No governor called for a special investigation. Everyone knew. But no one wanted to know. Weeks passed. Then months. The world moved on. The Oakwood County Courthouse remained standing, its marble pillars as pristine as ever. Trials continued, sentences were handed down, deals were made behind closed doors. But something had changed. No judge in Oakwood County ever dared to let their bias dictate their rulings again. Defendants who once feared the worst now found cases dismissed due to procedural errors. Lawyers who once prepared for the inevitable loss now walked out of court with victories they never expected. The shift was subtle, but it was real. The message had been sent. Loud, clear, final. And Desmond Turner never spoke of it. Not to Camille. Not to his closest advisors. Not even to Reggie Marks, who had been the first to warn him. He carried on his duties as mayor. Signed bills. Attended meetings. Shook hands at charity galas. Smiled for the cameras. It became a ghost story in the halls of power. A whispered legend in backroom meetings. A cautionary tale among those who sat on high benches and thought themselves untouchable. Desmond simply continued his work. But every now and then, when his staff left for the night and the city was quiet, he would sit alone in his office, staring out at the skyline, the streetlights casting long shadows across his desk. And in those moments, he would allow himself to wonder, just for a second, if justice had truly been served, or if he had merely become the very thing he once fought against. And as the night stretched on, Desmond would lean back in his chair, close his eyes, and listen to the silence. Not guilt. Not regret. Just the silence. The kind that powerful men fear. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm sure you'll also love the next one. Click on the video on the screen right now, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching until the end. See you soon.